Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome. This is the 6th webinar in our CLE series on key legal considerations for business reopening and rebounding. Today's program focuses on privacy and cybersecurity and the risks of working from home. That's what we'll be talking about through the whole hour. If we could all see each other on this call, I suspect many of us are probably doing exactly that right now. So my name is April Doss. I'm the chair of the Saul Ewing Arnstein and Lear Cybersecurity and Privacy practice. I also co-chair our Congressional Investigations practice. Prior to coming here to Saul Ewing, I spent over a decade with the National Security Agency. I served as senior minority counsel for the Russia investigation at the United States Senate and the Select Committee on Intelligence. And currently I represent clients across industry sectors on cybersecurity and privacy matters of all kinds. Our presenters for today's webinar are my colleagues, Beth Fenton and Catherine Beaumont Murphy. Beth is a partner in our cybersecurity and privacy practice based in our Wilmington, Delaware office. Beth focuses her practice on litigation involving trade secrets, restrictive covenants, corporate governance, and white-collar criminal defense. Catherine serves as the chair of the firm's K-12 schools practice and is counsel in the firm's cybersecurity and privacy practice. Catherine worked in-house for an international financial services corporation, where she worked on IT contracting and data privacy issues, and also as in-house counsel for a K-12 school, where she oversaw the institution's GDPR compliance. She currently counsels schools as well as ed tech companies on data privacy issues, and is particularly focused right now on helping schools tackle the challenges and risks of online learning. So that's a little bit about us, your presenters. And before we begin, I just want to give you a few housekeeping announcements. First, Q&A. You can submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen. We will do our best to answer all the questions that are submitted during the webinar. But if we run out of time, we are happy to follow up by email unless you've submitted the question anonymously. So please feel free to identify yourself and your question if you'd like an individual follow-up. In terms of CLE, today's program has been approved for distance learning CLE credits in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. We have applications pending for CLE approval in Minnesota and Florida. As a CLE provider, we must be able to verify your attendance. So at random points during the webinar, we will display and verbally announce 2 numeric reporting codes that you must record and report back to us using the CLE survey that you received in your webinar reminder earlier today. We will then in turn send you your certificate of attendance once we receive your survey response. So please be sure to respond to the Saul Ewing CLE survey with your numeric codes within 5 days of the program in order to qualify for that CLE credit. All right. 2 more housekeeping details. The webinar recording and handouts. Within 48 hours of this program, you'll receive an email that says, "Thank you for participating." And that email will include links to the webinar recording. It'll include a program handout and a CLE survey. And lastly, because we are lawyers, here is our legal disclaimer. The provision and receipt of the information in this program is not legal advice, does not create a lawyer-client relationship, and should not be acted on without seeking professional counsel who've been informed of the specific facts in the matter you're addressing. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, work from home, new risks and the new normal. So this has become the reality rapidly. We all remember, depending on exactly where in the country you are, the time frame may have varied slightly, but roughly in March, companies and organizations of all kinds all around the country had to very abruptly shift large sections of their workforce to some kind of telecommuting, generally work from home. By and large, this happened without without a lot of infrastructure in place to have everybody working from home. Who's working from home? It's the knowledge workers. The knowledge workers are the ones who are most likely to have access to sensitive information and to the systems that store it. And so we're going to talk about the specific privacy and cyber risks involved in that. And very often, organizations didn't have in place a comprehensive set of policies and procedures on how to keep information safe and secure, whether it's in soft copy or hard copy, while people are working from home. So a whole new set of challenges. Here we are, 3-4 months on from that. And the one thing that we know about this situation is that COVID will be with us for a while. For many people who are able to work from home, they will be continuing to work from home for some time. And so the complex set of challenges that come with personal devices, home networks, multiple users, lack of policies, a mixed IT environment, all of those are creating, they're complicating a legal risk landscape that already existed in cybersecurity and privacy. So let's go to the next slide. When you think about work from home, again, I'm guessing that many of us on the call, if we could all see each other, are probably doing exactly that right now. What are people doing, right? They're logged into a laptop or a desktop computer. It's probably their personal device. Maybe they've got a VPN they can log into securely at work. They're trying to homeschool their kids. The dog is barking. The cat's scratching on the furniture. The doorbell is ringing. Maybe there's a spouse or a partner who's also working from home. Everybody's trying to share the bandwidth. The kids are video gaming. There's a lot going on, a lot of distractions. And distractions are exactly the kind of circumstance that malicious cyber actors do a very good and effective job at taking advantage of. And so these banner headlines on this slide are just a sample of what we see routinely. We are seeing lots of phishing emails coming out to people that are titled in a way to appear to be either health-related information about COVID-19. Here's the latest update from CDC, or some kind of charitable solicitation. Donate here to contribute money for personal protective equipment for healthcare workers. Or click here for an important update from the local school system where your children might be enrolled. All of the things that are sort of attention grabbing. In the course of that attention grabbing, what we see is ransomware getting downloaded, credentials being stolen, and we'll talk about some of the ways that plays out. So we're talking about busy, distracted, stressed out people trying to do all the things that they would ordinarily have done previously from an office, but without that bit of quiet, calm, and protected IT infrastructure that they likely would have had access to in an office. That middle headline there, by the way, FBI warns of teleconferencing and online classroom hijacking during COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, that is Zoom bombing. You've probably heard of it. You probably will have noticed that in the Zoom call that you're on right now, this is a password protected Zoom. When they are not, the FBI is seeing a huge uptick in people, uninvited people popping into meetings and either posting child pornography or posting hate speech or engaging in other really kind of disturbing and in some cases unlawful behavior. And this is what's popping up in the middle of people's work calls. If they haven't had a chance to think through from an organizational perspective what kind of policies, procedures, and guidance need to be in place to make sure that a call with a client or a customer or a business partner is going to be secured in the way that it needs to be, and that there's not going to be any kind of surreptitious recording that you don't know is happening. So there's a lot of dimensions to it. So that's just a little bit of the context in this new normal that we're all living in. So let's go to the next slide and talk about the agenda. We're really going to go through 3 topics here. The risks of working from home, how to manage those risks, and what can go wrong. Of course, lots of things can go wrong, but what we're going to focus on are fraud and ethics considerations. For those of you who are earning CLE, you'll see at the bottom of that slide the CLE code 090686. Make sure you write that down because that is the code you're going to need for the CLE credit. All right, so let's move on. Cybersecurity and privacy. I think it helps to start with just a little bit of clarification. So these are closely related concepts. They are not identical. Cybersecurity in the traditional sense involves protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data and systems. So the confidentiality is making sure that information can only be accessed by, and systems can only be accessed by people who are properly authorized. Integrity means that nothing is altered. For example, data is not changed. And availability means when you need to log on, you can, or when you need to access the information, you can. So privacy applies to information that typically is about people and is protected under some kind of law or regulation. And often that information can be in hard copy or electronic form and still be protected. So the way that these 2 things intersect is, of course, you can have cybersecurity incidents that involve privacy risks or privacy breaches. A classic one is a data breach that involves compromise of personally identifiable information, compromise of somebody's social security number or credit card information. You can also have privacy risks that are solely in the hard copy realm. That is part of the work from home problem. And you can have cybersecurity risks that are not related in any way to privacy. And so those include business email compromise and ransomware. So I want to just quickly touch on each of these so that, we're kind of all thinking about things from the perspective of the same terminology. So in terms of cybersecurity risks, ransomware continues to rise. In fact, just saw a new report out earlier this morning that said that we have now reached the point at which an increasing percentage of ransomware types, sorry, let me back up. Ransomware, somebody gets unauthorized access to your computer system, and the ransomware, the malicious software, encrypts files so that the legitimate user, you, can no longer access the files. In some cases, it locks up an entire computer. In some cases, it spreads across an entire network. In some cases, it encrypts all kinds of files. In some cases, just some kinds of files. And then the hacker very, helpfully posts a pop-up notice on a monitor that says, pay me this number of Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency, or I will delete all your files. Some ransomware is self-executing and it deletes automatically. Some ransomware can be undone without paying the ransom. And for those of you who have protected health information, or that under HIPAA guidance, a ransomware incident involving a system that holds PHI, protected health information, is presumed to be a HIPAA breach unless there's been an investigation that demonstrates that there's a low probability that data was accessed. So for anybody who is a HIPAA covered entity or business associate, ransomware is particularly high risk, and there is only 60 days to run through that investigation and analysis. But currently, according to that study, currently the average amount of ransomware payments is now over 6 figures. And I'm sure you've read stories, articles about some of the eye-popping numbers that are involved. So protection against ransomware is absolutely a challenge. Business email compromise. This one, the numbers are harder to come by because people are frequently loath to report it. So the way this comes about, you've got somebody who's busy working from home, distracted, doing all the things, clicks on an email without recognizing that the email that looked like it was from a colleague was actually a spoofed email that came from somebody else, and a malicious actor who set up a similar looking account. And in clicking on that link or opening that attachment or navigating to that website that were in the malicious email, all of a sudden now the staff person in your office has given access to their login credentials to a hacker. This is a particular vulnerability in Outlook Web Access. Anybody who's using Office 365 for staff remote access should be really cautious about what kinds of settings are implemented, because the entire Outlook suite of remote tools can be made very secure, but it has to be configured properly to do that. So what happens with those credentials? If somebody gains access to credentials, they can gain access to really anything within a system or network that those credentials can access. And typically what we see happen is we see an email go out from those credentials. It looks like it's coming from the actual user saying, hey, I need you, vendor, to send your next payment on our invoice by wire to this bank account. Really important to know that once those funds get wired to the fraudulent account, they're typically not recoverable. They usually leave the account within moments of having hit it, certainly within a day or two. And really important to know from a cybersecurity insurance perspective that while cyber insurance typically covers the cost of incident investigation, the counsel and forensics work that goes with that typically covers the cost of incident notifications if there's been a breach that's reportable under a state data breach law or under HIPAA or some other applicable statute. Cyber insurance frequently does not cover any lost income or lost funds, whether it was incoming payments or outgoing payments, due to business email compromise. So that wire fraud money, if it's going to be recoverable through insurance, will often have to be recovered through some other kind of coverage, perhaps a crimes policy. This creates all kinds of havoc in business partnership relationships as parties try to sort out who's going to be responsible for making up the lost funds, whether they were incoming or outgoing. Theft of intellectual property is another area in which it's not a privacy breach typically, but it can be crippling from a business perspective. To the extent that intellectual property of any kind is at the heart of the business itself, obviously the loss of that intellectual property really can mean losing sort of the keys to the kingdom or the crown jewels from a business value perspective. But it also can include, in thinking about theft of intellectual property, it's useful also to think in broad terms around just loss or compromise of sensitive information. And so you've probably, you may remember the Panama Papers breach, very high profile breach of law firm files where highly sensitive information was compromised. In that case, there was certainly some personal privacy dimensions to that from the client perspective, but the larger context was that it was hugely embarrassing for the law firm involved and for many of their clients. And so there are lots of kinds of internal emails that would not be covered by an attorney-client privilege, for example, but just internal emails of executives or staff at any organization that could be highly embarrassing if compromised. So it's important to be mindful of that too.
If I can just jump in and talk a little bit about that, I think that with there being not only people working from home, but just some dislocation in the economy, people losing jobs, people changing jobs. I mentioned, April mentioned that I do a lot of restrictive covenant work, and that's really where this theft of intellectual property piece comes in. Client lists, customer lists, form contracts, things like that. You know, how are you protecting those? And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about fraud, but just from an issue spotting perspective, that is a ripe area for potential loss of secured information.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Thanks for that, Beth. On the privacy side, a lot of this we've touched on now already. Personally identifiable information, of course, is going to include anything that's under any U.S. state data breach law. Those are traditionally covered things like social security numbers and driver's license and financial account information. Do remember that this includes all the information of your employees as well as any customers. And be mindful that under the California Consumer Privacy Act, which took effect in January and starting tomorrow will be enforced by the Attorney General, really now a very wide-ranging definition of personal data that includes almost any information you can imagine about a California consumer or California household, and imposes a number of obligations, some of which have to do with breach reporting, and it does create a private right of action. Note also that if you have any information about persons outside the US, there may be other laws that come into play, including Canadian data privacy laws, the PIPEDA, and the provincial data privacy laws, and of course, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, which provides protections for individuals throughout the European Economic Area and includes data breach notifications among the other obligations. So in addition to those things, let's just think about, in this overlapping set of things that are cybersecurity and privacy. It's also important to be mindful that with people working from home, they're trying to figure out, how am I going to print this document I want to work with, right? And there is always a temptation for people to forward some kind of company information to their personal Gmail account because it's easier to print at home, right? Really important to make sure there's good policies and procedures in place around that kind of thing, and we'll talk about that later. Whether something has been printed at home or printed at an office and brought home, people are probably not accustomed to thinking about secure hard copy disposal when they're working from home. But it's every bit as important at home as it is at the office. People have Alexa everywhere, and if it's not Alexa, it's one of the other home digital assistants. Those conference calls are getting recorded. Confidential information may be getting overheard because there's other people in the household. So lots and lots and lots of privacy and cybersecurity risks to be thinking about. So let's go to the next slide. In addition to these, COVID itself is raising a number of novel issues. Lots of issues around biometric information. Right now, a handful of states do have various kinds of protections for biometric information. Most of those focus on the use of biometric data for purposes of identifying a person, as opposed to simply, for example, taking somebody's temperature when they walk into a building. But as businesses everywhere are looking at all kinds of measures to help either identify people who are potentially symptomatic or to do contact tracing, there's lots of novel questions around the use of biometric information, around the use of location data. This is primarily being captured through mobile phone apps, but can be captured through other means as well. Use of surveillance cameras in both public spaces, if, for instance, in the lobby of a building and things like that, and in controlled spaces, for example, internal surveillance cameras within, a retail establishment, things like that. Public health tracking broadly. I mentioned location data, but there are certainly other kinds of data that is being used or being considered for tracking of public health, tracking for public health analysis purposes. And just broadly speaking, data analytics. And the ways that different kinds of data either are being or can be combined to assess COVID spread and COVID risk. So all of these rules are complicated and they vary. They vary according to what kind of individual is affected, whether it's an employee, whether it's a building visitor, whether it's a customer, whether it's some other category. Depends on the jurisdictions. But just know that as people are looking to bring all kinds of tools and technologies to bear on COVID-related problems, there are additional privacy concerns, some of which guidance is still evolving. And so there's a whole set of issues there as well. So let's keep moving on. And Catherine,
one question. Sorry, April.
Yeah.
Just talking a little bit about the issue of students and schools, because I am working from my office today, but I have been working remotely, and my kids, and I think a lot of other people's kids were, quickly moved to virtual school environments. And I know that the school that my kids went to did send out something talking about privacy. But just, Catherine obviously is the expert on that. What kind of issues do we need to be thoughtful about regarding virtual education? Because I know there's a whole regulatory regime around that.
Yeah, and I think we'll get to that as we go through this, but that's a big concern, not only for companies, but also for anybody who's a parent. And what do they have to be concerned about? So April just went through, hi everyone, I'm Catherine Beaumont-Murphy. April just went through the risks that are attendant from working from home, both in terms of cyber vulnerabilities and privacy, and as well as some of the new COVID-specific concerns that employers should be thinking about. So in the next step of our agenda, we want to walk you through some practical steps on how to manage this risk, touching upon what Beth just said, but also things that might be germane to corporations and businesses as well. Some of this you may have already implemented, but your company may now be weighing how to integrate working from home into your long-term plans. And so you may need to shift your policies and procedures from sort of an immediate emergency basis into ongoing compliance that's focused on work from home. So I'm going to quote April in one of the handout materials you're going to be getting as part of this CLE. And she wrote that cybersecurity is never just an IT issue. It is always about the combination of people, processes, and the technology. So first and foremost, it starts with employees. And we'll keep emphasizing this throughout this webinar. You can't assume that your employees are aware of all the risks that April just listed. And even if they are, that they're going to remember these risks during their day-to-day work tasks. You may already have an acceptable use policy, but maybe you want to integrate this acceptable use policy into a broader new remote work policy, or maybe you want to create a standalone work policy. And so what would this policy entail? Well, it'll capture a lot of the risks that April just mentioned, but here are some suggestions to think about as you move through this, thinking about it in a very holistic way. So first, you want to think about, and April mentioned this, do you want to prohibit forwarding information to personal email? Why is this? A couple of reasons. First of all, by signing up to use a personal email like Gmail, you give consent for Google to scan the contents of this email, and it may mine them, and that's why you get all those targeted advertisements that you wonder how you're getting. Many people are aware that this happens, but you may not have thought about this in the context of a security threat to your organization as well. In addition, once email gets forwarded to your Gmail account, your company then can't monitor where it goes after that. So for example, I used to work for a big multinational financial services company, and our IT department would be able to monitor when a number of emails were going from one person to an outside account, and whether or not that account was a Gmail, and whether or not it was that person's Gmail, either in bulk or over a course of time, and it would flag that, and people would get questioned about it. Now, your company may or may not have the capacity to do this, but that's a question you maybe want to ask your IT people. So how do you ensure that this doesn't happen? Any of these things I'm telling you, you've got to think about, you have a policy, but how might you be able to monitor the policy? So you're going to be wanting to involve your IT people as we think through this. Something else you might want to think about along those same lines is storing data in a non-secure cloud account. Again, Google Docs, something of the like. Again, how can you monitor this if you need to? So something else to ask your IT people, something else to think about given the nature of your data, if that's something you need to put in a policy that you prohibit. Thinking about downloading onto USBS drives. Again, the thing about this is that it just makes you vulnerable about where your information can go outside of your secure network. April mentioned taking sensitive documents home. Again, what is your industry? What is your company? There may be situations where this is unavoidable. If you're lawyers, for example, there just may need to be documents you need to have at home. The CEO, the CFO may need to bring sensitive documents home. But do the rest of your knowledge workers really need to do this? So you want to really think through the information you have, who has access to it, and how you allow access in a practical way, considering the confidentiality of your documents. Be clear about it is the important takeaway here. And again, where do your employees take sensitive calls and on what sorts of devices? This may be something that you haven't had to think about before. And so quite simply, your employees may not be thinking about it. April mentioned things like Google and Alexa. So these types of devices have things called wake-up words, so that when you say, like, you hear the hard sound in Alexa, like you've all experienced this, where you're just talking, you know, if you have an Alexa in your kitchen and you say a word and all of a sudden it goes on, it starts to record things. And so your phone calls, your conversations can be recorded, even if you don't outright say Alexa, but if you have that hard K sound. There have been big corporations which have made part of their work from home policy, make sure all of your devices of this nature are turned off before you get on a call. And then finally, any sort of remote work policy will want to consider how employees can notify the company of a suspected data breach or network compromise or violation of the policy. So the takeaway here for your employees is, again, start with them. They are probably the most important link in your cybersecurity policy, one of the most important links in this holistic cybersecurity approach, particularly now when they're scattered all over the place. So think through what your business is, what sensitive information you have, how it gets passed around the corporation. Think about the vulnerabilities of this information in a home environment. And then here's the really key takeaway: give clear guidance to your employees about your expectations. And then work through how you are going to enforce this guidance. Talk to your IT people about how that can be monitored, and think about the repercussions for violations of this policy. Is it a warning? Is it a suspension? Is it up to and including termination? I can't help but think about, we've all heard the stories about the people who leave a briefcase full of confidential documents in a taxi. This is like that multiplied by 1,000. It's 1,000 more employees, and it's not just a taxi, it's homes all over the country. So taking that simple anecdote and thinking about what you might do were your employee to leave a briefcase in a taxi, how are you going to apply that to this new context and environment? So if we can go to the next slide. The next step, we're going to move on to, again, thinking about cybersecurity is not just being technology, but also people and processes. We're going to start talking about the processes. Part of that process is contract review, and that's whether that's of your existing agreements with an eye towards privacy and cybersecurity, but new agreements. Have you instituted any new SaaS agreements, that software as a service, or other platforms to support your remote work? Did you implement or upgrade your VPN technology? So you really want to go through a checklist of your business partners, your suppliers, and your own technology to make sure that you've got sensible cybersecurity and privacy measures in place. These types of measures include, and these are what's in the blue boxes over on the right side of this slide, indemnification provisions for any costs that you incur as a result of a cybersecurity error or omission by your vendor or partner. You want to make sure that the contract does not limit your vendor's liability in a way that would allow them to avoid paying a fair share of damages. So to do this, you may need to, if you've got some sort of mutual limitation of liability, you may need to carve out cybersecurity and privacy from any of these limitation clauses. Have your vendors given access to your systems or data to their own third parties? If so, you want to make sure that liability flows through should there be a breach on the end of the third party, that your vendor or partner will be responsible for their own third party partnerships as well. And finally, you may have cybersecurity insurance coverage, but do you require your vendors to do so on your insurance sheet? It's probably a no-brainer, but this may be the time to reassess those levels, who you require it of, as more and more people are working from home. Depending on your industry and depending on your vendors, these issues can require a lot of negotiation. They can be tricky. This is something you may want to visit with an addendum at this point in time if you're looking forward at a long-term work from home strategy. But you need to ensure that your organization or your company upholds its responsibilities to ensure that your partners are meeting the security expectations for your and their industries, which is even more important now as the work from home environment presents more opportunities for breach and fraud. So just as an example of this, Beth mentioned schools. You know, one of the things that I have seen schools do is go back and look at the platforms that they are using to provide the online technology and learning to their students. Maybe this was a contract that an administrator signed 3 years ago. Maybe it's Schoology, maybe it's Teachable. Both of those companies have likely updated their policies in the result of really explosive growth. And you need to make sure that you are aware of what their privacy policies are, what they're willing to do if there's a breach of policy, what information they're collecting from your students, if you need permission from the students or their parents for them to collect that sort of information. Again, 5 years ago, this might have been an issue and you might have looked at the contract, but because this is now a known thing, it would be difficult as a school or an organization to argue that you didn't have knowledge or foresight that any of these cyber or privacy issues could happen in this very expanded environment. So that's just one example. So we're going to move on to some more policies as part of this holistic approach to cybersecurity in the next slide, and Beth will take over.
So some of the things to think about are your internal policies and the best practices you use in your firm up to date with the new environment. So I think a lot of companies had policies prior to this, but the policies were contemplated that people would be working from home intermittently, certainly not full time. So it's a good idea to pull those policies out and see if there's anything that needs to be updated. You know, what are your obligations of oversight to confirm that those policies are being actually adhered to? And I think about you know, the Zoom bombing, for example. When we first went into this environment, we were all kind of new to it. We didn't have the experience to identify the issues, but now we're several months in and it doesn't look like we're going to be moving into a full-time in the office environment anytime soon. And so, you know, do you need to revisit how you are monitoring that? I mean, is it time to perhaps implement something like Catherine talked about at her former employer? Is it time to, you know, tell everyone, look, you need to change all of your passwords because, you know, we've been home for 3 months. The policies that you had are not automatically going to be implemented in this situation. So you may not even need to update things. You may just need to remind folks of what they were already obligated to do. the other thing that I think is really important, and we've had internally a task force that has monitored what's going on in all the jurisdictions where we're working these days. And, there's guidance coming out on a weekly, if not daily basis from state regulators in various industries, from the CDC, about, what are the best practices for, things that might be implicated in the biometric piece and the protected health information piece. The other thing I think that is really critical is, giving employees the option to work from home. You don't want to get into a situation where you're finding out more than necessarily you want to know about as far as your employees' personal situations that could then, set you up for a potential discrimination case down the road. And likewise, thinking about, the situation of people with kids and how are you going to deal with long-term parent and caregiver situations where folks are having to juggle all of those things, and that may lead them to, miss when there's an external email coming in that's clearly from a, spoofed account or a fraudulent account. So all of these things are things to really get moving on now if you haven't already, because as April and Catherine have both indicated, this is here to stay, and your industry, a lot of trade groups, a lot of chambers of commerce are releasing guidance as well. So there's a lot of different sources of information. And the key is, again, to find those trusted sources and reliable sources. So it's a good opportunity to revisit all this. And it's a good opportunity to think about, what might not have been working in your past policies about IT and taking stuff out of the office, et cetera. One thing that's not on the slide that I did want to make a note of, and it's just sort of an issue spotting question, is what are you doing about US mail? We still get, as lawyers, I still get US mail from courts, from rarely from clients, but we have had folks in our offices, checking the US mail, and how are you protecting that? Our solution has been that our mail person, sends us whatever the outside the envelope is, and then we can say, you can open it or not. But some people get personal mail at work, and so again, it's just something to think about. I have a case right now where there's text messages. What is your policy about text messaging from employees to each other? In this particular case, a lot of the text messages had to do with COVID-19, and personal health information. And so you just have to take that added level of care. And hopefully, the best practice really is not to use things like text messaging and WhatsApp and, Facebook Messenger and LinkedIn Messenger. But the reality is it's going to happen. So how are you going to deal with that? So these are all things that were issues before, but COVID-19 has really put a finer point on them. Mary, can you move us to the next slide? So one of the things to do, and this is something that all of us have experience in and have represented various clients in dealing with this, whether it's a crisis because you had a data breach, a crisis because you have a student issue or a faculty issue, a crisis because you have litigation and theft of trade secrets. These are issues that come along in all of our areas of practice. And so how are you going to deal with that? And what's the best way to formulate a plan? Really what is the best practice is to just designate someone and say, this is going to be your area of responsibility. Task that person with identifying what experts need to be brought in. Do you need to bring in counsel? Do you need to hire a forensic expert? And then setting just those regular meetings, especially we don't see each other in the hall anymore, so we can't have those conversations. So one of the best practices that we've been implementing is, with our clients and internally as well, is just set up those regular times. If you don't end up needing to have a call, you don't have to have it, but at least every week or every few days or whatever it is, you're going to check in and discuss what's going on, because it's so easy to even forget what day it is, that you just got to build in a lot of safeguards that we did not have to do previously. And it's just so important to have somebody designated with that lead role, and then get them the right resources and give them the responsibility to make sure folks know what's going on. And again, this applies to data breach, this applies to litigation, this applies to counseling. It's something we have to be a lot more conscious of now that we're in the work from home situation. And figuring out who needs to know is also a critical piece, because a lot of times the IT folks are not necessarily communicating with the HR folks, who are not necessarily communicating with the legal folks. So these are just practical things to think about as you implement this work from home environment. And again, not necessarily things we were thinking of on March 15th, but as we've had the experience, things that make a lot of sense. If we could go to the next slide, Mary. And we're coming up on about 15 minutes. I don't think we've had any questions, but of course, feel free to send questions along, and we'll be happy to talk about those. So I do a lot of litigation involving fraud, and as April said, a lot of the things that we see with fraud are not new. Ransomware was happening before, but there's just this added level of vulnerability with people, working outside of, what they consider normally the four walls of being in an office. There's a lot more fluidity. So you just, the cyber criminals are taking advantage of that. And I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but, just an uptick in spam phone calls, spam text messages, spam emails, having to be really careful about what is getting picked up in your spam filter, because again, things may be slipping through that are important, and having an effective spam filter. So we talked about this a little bit in the prior slide, but what kind of controls are you going to implement to make sure that the data privacy, personal privacy, trade secret privacy, intellectual property protection, that those things are being protected in a work from home environment? This may lead to guidance from the accounting world as to how we deal with those issues, what kinds of new software needs to be brought in, what kinds of implementation and customization. As April said, Outlook is very customizable, but it's not necessarily going to be just the generic version that comes out of the box is not necessarily going to have the protections you need for your industry. Likewise, if you're in a specialized industry that has, Salesforce or medical records, scheduling for schools, for sports, for all kinds of different things, those companies are going to need to look at what, as Catherine said, are the policies that are in place, and are they up to date? Because it's really a whole new world. We also, because of the reduced oversight and communication across the organization, that's just, it's just happening because people are scattered, that may need attention, and it may need attention from not just the IT folks, but the HR folks, and of course the legal folks, and of course, we at Sol Ewing are happy to help with any of those kinds of issues that come up and talk about best practices. I think there's going to be a lot of insurance guidance, frankly, coming out of this to policyholders. I am certainly not an insurance expert, but I think there's going to be a new market for new kinds of policies that will be based on the risks of people not following the rules when Alexa is listening onto a highly confidential call, or Google is listening. I have Alexa and Google in my house, and they're not anywhere near where I'm doing client work. And that's very deliberate. In addition, I basically only use them as radios, but that's a different story. The other thing is, do you need to be more aggressive about encrypting documents? Do you need to be more aggressive in designating when you circulate documents to people that it should not be distributed? I think we have certain assumptions about that people know things about how data should be treated, that people are, general employees, even in the knowledge workforce, are aware of these laws, the EU data privacy rules, the California rules that are going in and that are going to be, a benchmark for the state, for the whole entire United States. And so those are going to be opportunities to revisit these questions in the context of COVID-19. And then, one other of the points here that Catherine, I think, came up with that I thought was a great one is, as companies are restructuring their workforces to deal with the fact that they don't necessarily have people in the office, that, frontline workers are doing different kinds of things than they ordinarily are used to doing. People are wearing more hats than they had to before because of all the changes that COVID has wrought. Are you being clear with your employees about what they need to do to safeguard this material, what they need to do when they communicate with other employees, what they need to do when they communicate with customers or clients? And again, these are not the kind of things that somebody's going to walk up to you to talk about. So you have to be really, I don't know if a confidential hotline is necessary, but really think about having somebody to be the point person and identifying areas of responsibility. If you don't do it now, people are going to get used to not having these policies in place. And then when you try to implement it on the back end, it's going to be more difficult. And it's going to expose your business to risk that you can avoid if you give some thought to it now. So if we can move to the next slide, Mary. So we have a couple of hypos, and we don't have a whole lot of time left. So Catherine, did you want to read the first one, or do you want me to?
I can do it. All right. So, well, first, we have our second CLE code. That is 105. Sorry, no, just, 105421. That's 105421 is our second CLE code, 105421. Right, so we have a couple of hypotheticals here, and these may seem like no-brainers to you, particularly after we've just spent an hour talking about cybersecurity and fraud and all of the risks. But these are the types of hypotheticals that we want to give you as takeaways to bring to your employees, and to have these types of conversations with them, and give them scenarios so they can identify things that they may not be thinking about as they're settling into this new environment. So some of these have to deal with privacy, some of these have to deal with cybersecurity, and some of these are just sort of common sense, ethical hypotheticals. So we're going to go through them. I'll read the first one. You receive an email from your CEO with the subject line, external email, urgent request. And that is not a typo on my part. That's how it's spelled on the email you get. Telling you to click a link to confirm your personal email for emergency communications during COVID. So this is like a law school issue spotting cyber exam. So April and Beth, why don't you sort of walk us through all of the issues of this very urgent request from the CEO of the company, and why you might want to sort of raise some tentacles and to tell your employees to be on alert for these types of emails.
Absolutely. So First of all, if your organization marks external emails, good, that's great. If you don't, consider talking with either your in-house or outside IT providers to see if that can be done, because it's a great flag. Year after year, studies show that over half of cybersecurity incidents originate with insiders. And by and large, those are not malicious insiders. It is usually fully authorized personnel who are moving quickly and make a mistake. And responding to a phishing email is the most common mistake that then can lead to all kinds of other problems, whether, again, it's ransomware, data breach, business email compromise, or any of the other things it can lead to. So make sure, if you didn't have it before, that now you have a mechanism for training employees while they're working from home on what to look for misspelled emails, to look for external addresses when it's from a colleague at work. Why is this marked as an external email? To look for awkward grammar, to look for anything out of the ordinary that are those key indicators of a likely malicious email, a likely phishing email. And in the course of thinking about how you can reach employees on issues like how to spot phishing emails and how important it is to take care before clicking on links and responding and things like that. One of the things that we've seen a lot of organizations do in these last few months, while so many people are working from home, and in some cases, for some organizations, while there's been a temporary downturn in business, we've seen a lot of folks actually use the time to organize the privacy and cybersecurity training for their workforce. Have everybody log in on a Zoom call, or Hangout, Skype, whatever is your enterprise platform. Make sure it's an enterprise platform for doing this, not just one of the free services that somebody can bomb into. But have everybody dial in for an hour and a half training on privacy and cybersecurity, so that you can talk to your staff about all these issues, what the policies are, and what kind of red flags to look for in an email, exactly like the one in that first example.
I think one other red flag here too is the fact that it's COVID related, and April mentioned this to begin with. A lot of hackers and perpetrators are using the COVID emergency to get your attention, and you might think it's like, oh my God, it's a COVID, they need my email for a COVID emergency, or, oh my gosh, I need to give them my information so they can give me updates on the latest counts in my area. That's, and we're all vulnerable to that, and the hackers know it. So that was another red flag in this one.
Yeah, and also I love how you put all these issues in there, Catherine. The CEO, I don't normally get emails on a regular basis from our CEO. And I certainly don't get urgent ones from him usually. So, so there's all kinds of red flags here, but I just think it's a great time to give people a refresher. And I love April's idea of just scheduling a meeting to talk about these things, because we all could use a refresher. So the second one is working diligently from home. You're trying to finalize a sensitive partnership deal you started in 2019. Your significant other works across the dining room table, but wearing headphones. So the two of you just conduct all your Zoom calls in the same room together. April, any concerns about this situation?
You're on mute, April. Classic Zoom issue.
Sorry about that. Yeah, potentially, of course. In this case, you're talking about somebody who the employee has a personal trust relationship with, but who, from a confidentiality perspective, that spouse or significant other is not within the circle of trust from a business perspective. So noise canceling headphones are great. We all have come to love them in these last few months, but really important not to rely on them. And again, important as part of employee training to let people know that. Let me just interrupt for one moment to say, I know that our programs end promptly at the cutoff time. So I think we are about to get cut off. Catherine, do you want to say anything quickly about the last scenario?
Don't toss your files into the regular garbage if they're sensitive.
There we go. Thank you all. If there's anything we can do to be helpful in follow-up, do let us know. And do remember, if you're getting CLE credit, look for that email that's going to give you, that's going to ask you to respond to the CLE survey. If we didn't get to your question, please feel free to follow up by email with any one of us. And let us know how we can be helpful on policies, contracts, training, or any other questions that you may have. That's what we're here for. It's been a pleasure spending this time with you.